And thank you indeed to the organizers for having me here. It is a moving occasion to be at an event where one thinks that Piotr should be here, really should be, somehow isn't. So very glad to be part of what is also a commemoration of his work and his inspiration. My paper is entitled Foreign Language and Utopia in Eastern European Neo-Avantgarde Art of the 1960s and 70s. The theme of this conference relates to boundaries, and it's worthwhile thinking about the fact that in Eastern Europe, the idea of the border was by no means, as our Cold War-wired brains would have it, limited to the Berlin Wall. It is worth remembering that compared to other regions of the world with which it is often compared, notably South America, Eastern Europe is a space crisscrossed by linguistic borders that need to be negotiated and whose effect was not, as was perhaps the case in the West, attenuated by a common lingua franca, a position that Russian was in no position to fill. I became of foreign languages by artists from the region because it occurred to me that the much commented upon turn to language by artists from Eastern Europe during the 1960s and 70s was rarely addressed as a turn to any specific language, and that this deprived it of specificity and material concreteness. Eastern European artists were not only a lot more linguistically adept than they are given credit for, their linguistic orientation was also much more often lateral, that is, directed at another Eastern European language rather than a so-called Western one, than might be assumed. For instance, when Gabor Altojai and Tamas Sentiobi traveled to Poland in the 1970s, both apparently spoke enough Polish to get them by. A.R. Penck is said to have learned Russian so he could read Lenin in the original. When another GDR artist, Karl Friedrich Klaus, who spent his entire life in provincial Saxony in the deep, disconnected south of the country, in the early 1970s began to correspond with his friend Jarosław Kozłowski from Poznań, Klaus wrote in German, English, and the occasional Polish, while Kozłowski responded in near impeccable German. Klaus, already during the Nazi era, in fact, had begun, apparently as a sign of resistance, to study exotic languages such as Hebrew, Armenian, Russian, and Chinese. And I want to begin by showing you an example from this correspondence between Karl Friedrich Klaus and Jarosław Kozłowski from the 1970s. Just a few sample letters to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. In which he essentially writes that how happy it is that Kozłowski speaks German, and that for this reason, it's very easy for him to simply always write to him in German since he masters that language. And then he advises Kozłowski that he should answer him in whichever language is most convenient to him. Other examples from this correspondence. Here's a letter from Kozłowski to Klaus, typed as usual. In Polish, I would say accented yet excellent German, which is usually the case. But as I mentioned at the beginning, and this is a little bit my point, they actually switched from one language to another quite frequently. So here's a postcard that Kozłowski wrote to Klaus in the late 1970s, which begins in German. It's written on the occasion of the New Year, 1978. So at the end he writes, last few lines, wir denken über dich, lieber Freund, und wünschen dir alles Gute und good luck. Und hoffen, das werden wir schon bald wieder zutreffen hier oder in Annaberg, that's where he lived, and then love, Jarosław, Kinga, and Kuba. Another example, this is a letter from Klaus to Kozłowski in English. My dear friends, Kinga and Yaroslav in Cuba, thank you from heart for your letter from the 29th of July and your card. I imagine you by the seaside. You will have a good time there, and so on and so on. And then at the end, I have a lot of events to tell you with my best wishes. Bardzo serdeczne pozdrowienia. Karl Friedrich, and then for some reason he writes contemporanean. Not sure what that means. And here's a telegram from Kozłowski in English to Klaus from also the late 1970s. Now, of course, the reasons why artists from Eastern Europe became interested in foreign languages were not confined to correspondence. In Eastern Europe, as much as in the West, from the 1960s onward, issues of semiotics, translation, and language, together with a critique of the material aesthetic object, came to the fore. Yet, and here I come back to my previous point, in a linguistic environment that could not be more different from the West, especially, as I hope to show, as relates to the issue of English. So in other words, while in many cases the specific languages an artist turned to in either her work or in her correspondence may have been quite irrelevant, in others it may not. Additionally, we should not forget that unofficial Eastern European artists such as Klaus and Kozłowski were self-trained, or rather self-training scholars, autodidacts, whose actual work was in a sense to be found in a continuous process of intellectual self-perfection, not in the production of aesthetic objects. In Klaus's case, but also in Penk's, for example, philosophical considerations and political convictions came into play too. Artists who believed in the ideals of communism turned to foreign languages in the name of internationalism and cosmopolitan Bildung, or education. So when I began to think about this talk, I found out, as is so often the case, that someone had already written, at least to a degree, my paper. To boot, that someone was a good friend, Magdalena Moskalewicz, another Pole, who not so long ago published an article about the topic I want to address, language use among Eastern European artists, though luckily with a different emphasis, since Magda concentrates on the period after 1989. In her paper, she aligns the command of a foreign language with the desire to belong to a community, and ignorance in the language of that community with one's possible exclusion from it. In this spirit, she interprets the frequent use of French by intellectuals, artists, and writers in countries such as Poland, Romania, or the Czech Republic during an earlier post-war period, the 1950s, with reference to their aspiration to reconnect with pre-war trends in France, such as Cubism, Dadaism, Post-Impressionism, Surrealism, and so forth. Now, what is noteworthy about Magda's approach is that it correctly identifies the use of a foreign language by artists from Eastern Europe during that time, the 1950s and maybe the early 60s, as a strategic choice, much as the choice of informel and other forms of painterly abstraction during the 1950s had signaled an opposition to socialist realism, so too the choice of French as a kind of intellectual lingua franca was, at least at that time, much more than a mere convenience. It also staked out a political position, inasmuch as it aligned Eastern European artists with a different world order and aesthetic regime. As Piotr Piotrowski and others have noted, the orientation towards French implied at that time an appeal to pan-European universalism that drew strength from its orientation towards a strong center, Paris, and its concomitant neglect of languages and art scenes in the region. Now, the important shift in the 1960s, when conceptual tendencies gained the upper hand over informel, from French to English, as the arguably most widely used foreign language among Eastern European artists, though, as I demonstrated, by no means the only one, certainly reflects the shift of gravity in the global art world from Paris to New York, as well as the geopolitical realities of the Cold War, both of which were not lost on artists from Eastern Europe. On the one hand, the use of English, most common among practitioners of mail art, but widespread also among other non-official artists of the non-retinal variety, certainly spoke to the desire on the part of artists from the region to overcome the varying degrees of international isolation in which they lived and worked, and to join a Western art community that would give them exposure in a way they could not have at home. Yet, while this is the most common argument put forward to explain why artists from the region felt it was necessary to learn English, it actually did more than that, for it also shifted the terms of the linguistic universalism that had, that had assumed that French was the natural idiom of the progressive artist, with Paris as the natural center of her world, to a differently weighted model. Pragmatics aside, the use of English by artists from Eastern Europe from the 1960s onward, while it certainly signaled opposition to the homogenizing tendencies of official culture, gave a voice, more importantly, to the hope on the part of artists from the region that it might be possible to construct through the foreign language an international community whose organization would not be hierarchical and elitist, as its French predecessor had been, but horizontal and democratic, with the different countries of Eastern Europe as equally weighted nodal points in a network that had no natural center. And in this sense, Jarosław Kozłowski's and Andrzej Kostołowski's 1971 NET initiative, which was conceived in 1971 and sent in English and Polish to dozens of colleagues all over Europe, can serve as a paradigmatic example of the changes implicit in the switch from French to English. Indeed, NET, and here you can see the copy, if you could tell the difference, that I found in the archive of Karl Friedrich Claus in Chemnitz, is much more than an appeal not to provincialize Eastern Europe. It actually marks a real revolution in the way in which, from the 1960s onward, a different understanding of language modeled a different approach to art, understood as a translinguistic project that differed as such in any number of ways from the more vertical organization of the preceding French era. As Kozłowski and Kostołowski write, quote from this manifesto, "A net is open and uncommercial. Points of the net are private homes, studios, and other places where art propositions are articulated. Net has no central point and any coordination," unquote. As this passage from the famous appeal makes clear, its real goal was the formation of a network in which all the corresponding nodes, including the Eastern European ones, would carry the same weight. Of course, such a network already existed, and it was called International Mail Art, a network in which many Eastern European artists eagerly participated and where English was the most common, if not the only language used, reflecting a desire for a transnational but also a translinguistic practice whose element and medium would be circulation, not commercial success. Now, discussions of, this is what you've all waited for, discussions of the use of foreign languages by artists from Eastern Europe often begin with Mladen Stilinović's work, "An artist who does not speak English is not an artist." The phrase, coined and presented on a pink banner in 1989, is generally interpreted as a reference to the hegemonic position of English in an increasingly globalizing art market after the fall of the Berlin Wall, leaving Eastern European artists in a position where they could either swim by learning English and adapt to the rules and ways of the global art market, or sink by refusing to do so. The fact that Stilinović delivered his analysis in English is, in this context, usually seen as an ironic effect that only serves to corroborate the conclusion mentioned above. However, while we might accept this interpretation of Stilinović's phrase for the period after 1989, it cannot, and was never intended, as a model for explaining the allure of English in the 1960s and 70s, a time when its use implied not the inescapability of Western hegemony, with English as its linguistic masthead, but on the contrary, the promise of a real linguistic and cultural pluralism. In a letter written in English and Hungarian to his friends in the Eastern European and Western art community, a year after Kozłowski and Kosterowski conceived NET in 1972, Laszlo Béke made the point quite explicitly. Entitled Concept Art as the Possibility of Young Hungarian Artists, Béke's letter asserts that, and I quote from this letter, "We are working in Budapest, Hungary. We have neither galleries nor art collectors. Our possibilities for exhibitions and publicity are very rare. We are also aware of the momentarily general and grave crisis of art. Everybody has to be aware of the fact that Budapest," and this is for me the decisive sentence, "that Budapest is one of the frontier cities between West and East, but it is more important for us that Budapest is the capital city of a country lying in Eastern Europe. We want to live and work here," unquote. Now, what interests me about Béke's invocation in 1972 of a network over a more hierarchically organized community that would include in equal measure artists from East and West, and that is as such an equivalent to NET's operation without central point of coordination, as Kozłowski wrote, is the fact that it is written in a language, English, or also written in a language, English, we have since come to associate with the homogenizing conceits of globalization, to which Stilinovic, of course, alludes. Yet for Béke, there is no contradiction between the foreign and the non-foreign. I quote him again from the same letter, we neither intend to do particularly Hungarian art, nor to be characteristic. There is no contradiction," unquote. Béke's pronouncement, I think, sums up neatly the attitude of Eastern European artists towards English as well. Eastern Europeans are happy to speak English, yet they do so with a strong local accent. The often bilingual nature of declarations and appeals such as Béke's has, in this sense, not only a pragmatic function, it also, I think, testifies to the idea that the labor of translation to which texts such as his testify is a vivid reminder of the need to build a world in which every nation and every language can take its rightful place. Coming back to English, it may be worth remembering that Eastern Europe, for the most part, of course, lacked exposure to Western-style commercial advertising culture, with its heavy reliance on US English as the quasi-lingua franca of the Western Hemisphere. As Alexander Albero has shown, the emergence of conceptual art in the US and the West, more generally, was inseparable from this culture, with its accelerated flows of information and exchange. And let me briefly quote him. Albero writes, "The emergence of conceptual art is closely related to this new moment of advanced capitalism. Indeed, conceptualism's unusual formal features and mode of circulation in many ways utilize and enact the deeper logic of informatization." Here's an example. Albero further claims, perhaps controversially, that even the emancipatory effects of conceptual art, its critique of the commercial art object and the gallery system, or its appeal to viewer participation, for example, came part and parcel with such commerce-driven informatization, not an uncontroversial claim, of course. But I want to quote him again, nevertheless. "The egalitarian pursuit," he writes, "of publicness and the emancipation from traditional forms of artistic value were as definitive as the fusion of the artwork with advertising and display," unquote. Of course, Albero's analysis opens as many questions as it answers, but leaving those aside, we can say that in Eastern Europe, where despite Boris Groys's claims to the contrary, official propaganda, and admittedly Groys makes the point about the Soviet Union, but official propaganda was in no position to rival the synthesizing powers of Western-style consumerism or advertising, the situation was entirely different. Again, leaving aside the Soviet Union, where foreign language use by artists was, due to their utter isolation, much less frequent, in East Central Europe, what might be called the promise of English as an idiom of international exchange and community remained intact, retaining an element of earnest utopianism that had not yet, as was the case in the West, become objectified in late capitalist informatics, even though it eschewed the often sleek linguistic packaging of Western conceptual art. Of course, in the form of mail art, as I had mentioned before, where English in combination with other languages was the dominant form of expression, the utopian promise of English had a quasi-institutional outlet. And there was another special case, Poland, where semi-autonomous galleries such as Adris, Remont, or Akumulatory 2 issued calls for papers and other communications in a type of near-flawless, if accented English, whose dense discursive style connected more or less seamlessly with the art world English that was developing at the same time in the West. Otherwise, the very clunkiness of English use in other parts of Eastern Europe owed itself to the fact that, indeed, most artists from the region simply spoke no or only bad English. If the language was taught at school, it was often taught badly and by teachers who had all too often never themselves been in an English-speaking country. And so artists in the 1960s and 70s were, as I mentioned, busy learning English with old-fashioned vocabulary lists or stultifying textbooks issued by evening schools. So a couple of slides I didn't show. What I mentioned about the flawless English of some institutions in Poland. Here's Galeria Adris, an invitation to a film festival written in completely flawless English, by whom I'm not sure, although we discussed it yesterday a little bit. And then another invitation to a conference in Warsaw, Remont Gallery in the late 1970s, in a type of English that actually mimics very impressively this sort of art English that was developing at the time in the West, and of course that blossomed into full bloom, yeah, in the 1980s and 90s. But what I really wanted to show you were examples of the kinds of learning tools used by artists in the 1970s. Again, my example is Carl Friedrich Claus, who kept these exercise books that you can find in his archive for learning these various languages, including English, in which he would jot down phrases and also make a note of words he didn't know. So this is the kind of thing that you encounter. So the result was that English and other foreign languages retained in the region an aura of being somehow a project, an autodidactic project, an ongoing exercise in auto-instruction, with sometimes startling results. So for example, Ruth-Wolf Rehfeld, an artist who has recently come to some prominence again from East Germany. So she named a whole series of her works in the 1970s with English titles. And her English was quite good. She went to evening school to brush up on her English that she had learned at school badly. And so one of the titles she used was KGBing. Now, first of all, she claims that there's absolutely no relation to the KGB here, although I immediately put this to her and said, did you mean to allude to the KGB? And she said, oh no, I have no idea what you're talking about. Now that could be dismissed easily. But then she also completely, with the utmost self-assurance said that KGBing means a being in a cage. When in English, KG actually means something quite different. But she insisted on this. So there is an idiosyncratic way in which English became assimilated to by these artists in ways that almost made it their own. It really had took on a life of its own, as it maybe only could in a region such as Eastern Europe. So this didactic, propositional function of English for Eastern European artists has everything to do with the fact that as a language for them, it lacked a proper referent, be it in the form of non-existent consumer objects, or be it in the form of a direct experience with a space or country where English was spoken. Since either were elusive for most Eastern European artists, English retained a certain abstractness, which ironically freed it up to function in other ways. And this indeed is the problem addressed in one of Jaroslaw Kozłowski's better-known works, The Book and the Performance Lesson, for which I may not have time because I'm told that I only have 2 minutes, which is fine, whereby the artist partially strips an English language schoolbook of its purely functional qualities and instead turns it into an object of didactic demonstration. And just very briefly, maybe to sum up my analysis of this before I conclude. So on the one hand, of course, Lesson, as other works by Kozłowski at the time, reflect his interest in linguistic philosophy and pragmatic philosophy and philosophical formalism. But it's also clearly an appropriation that reflects his own experience with learning English, in that he ends up injecting into this textbook photographs juxtaposing the graphics that you can see on the left of this sort of stultifying family of Mr. Brown and Mrs. Brown and their little kid, I think, or dog, with a photograph of his own family in the same sort of poses. So sort of an act of appropriation that deprives the textbook of its universalism, in which I see a gesture that seems to me similar to the way in which, let's say, Becke had before claimed for English a status that would be that of an equal nod or part in the network that he wished to construct among artists. So this sort of utopian idea that there can be a pluralism of language in which none has a universal application. So the gist of my interpretation of this work was sort of going to be along those lines, but I don't have time, and I think you're getting the point. So I think I'd like to conclude here and then leave the rest for question time. Thank you very much for listening.